welcome to Roll for Adventure. I'm Trent.
I'm Bonnie.
And I'm Bren.
And today we're looking at Microscope, a game where you get to create your own historical timeline.
Microscope is quite different from most RPGs. You don't have your own character, things aren't played chronologically, and there's no game master. Microscope is a storytelling game at its heart.
You can play with as few as 2 players, but 3 or 4 is probably best. All you need is a bunch of index cards or paper, some pens, and a table to play on.
First, you have to figure out what type of story you want to tell. Do you want to dive into the history of a magical kingdom? Maybe you want to tell the story of mankind's journey to the stars.
Yeah, you can create any kind of world or universe for your history to take place in. At this point, anything goes.
You need to frame the story with a start and end point, as well as a few rules for the universe. It might seem a bit daunting at first, but don't worry, the book walks you through the necessary steps, and it's quite simple, really.
Now your story is ready to go, and you can start playing. There's no initiative in Microscope, you just go around the table. Taking your turn is as simple as writing down a sentence on a card and placing it down somewhere on the timeline.
There are 3 different types of cards you can play, each nested under the other. The top level of these cards are known as periods. These are large chunks of time, ranging from years to centuries. You use these to set up the big arcs of your story.
Under periods, you can play events, which are fairly self-explanatory and flesh out the details of your world. We'll come back to the 3rd type of card later.
So using these periods and events, you start to stitch together a history for your world. You can play new cards anywhere on the timeline, so things will constantly be in flux. You could create a new city, only to have another player destroy it further on down the line.
It can be a bit confronting when someone destroys a city that you worked so hard to create. But there are no fixed dates, so you can create as much history before the destruction as you want.
Each player has complete power when they're playing their cards. They can change whatever they like, as long as it doesn't contradict something that's already been established. You can't kill a character that appears later on in the timeline, for example.
Now we've avoided talking about the 3rd level of card that you can play because they really change the game up quite a bit, and we often leave them out of our games. The 3rd level of cards are known as scenes, and this is where the actual role-playing comes into the game.
Scenes are very specific points in time where a decision is made or a question answered. For example, you might have an event, the coalition declares war. You could easily put a scene in here where the heads of the coalition meet to decide whether or not they are going to join in the war.
The key mechanic of scenes is that they must answer a question. Continuing with our example, the question in this scene might be, will the particular member of the coalition join the war?
Once you've framed the scene, everyone takes on a role of a character in that scene, and you act it out until you've answered the question.
In practice, scenes are very simple to do, especially if you've got experienced role players. But the setup time that's needed to decide on the question and the characters often feels like it slows down the game. Ultimately, whether or not you decide to play with scenes will depend on the scenario and the group that you're playing with.
I know it all sounds pretty complicated, but this is actually a really easy game to pick up, and it provides a really unique experience.
Well, that's a quick breakdown of the core mechanics of Microscope. After the break, we'll go into the strengths and weaknesses of the game and give you our overall impressions. Stick around, we'll be right back. Welcome back to Roll for Adventure. We're having a look at the game Microscope. So guys, we've had a look at the core mechanics of the game, but how do you think you'd sum up the overall feel of Microscope?
Yeah, this is really a storytelling game at its heart, and it's great to sort of build this story together with your friends around the table.
Yeah, I also really like the fact that you can change the feel of the game during the setup phase. You can have a really dark and serious timeline, or you can have a really silly one.
It's very flexible. You can run any story you want.
Yeah, you can have, mankind goes to the stars, or the savory adventures of Princess Pfeffernuss.
Yeah, and the tone can really change as the game progresses. So, you can have these points in time that are quite serious, but then you can sort of mix it up as you add new elements to the game.
You should never actually expect a feel from a game. I've found that over the course of many, many games, that where you start is really not where you end up.
Yeah, often what we focus on, we don't even have particular civilizations fleshed out at the start of the game, yet they're introduced and they're seeded into the game, and then all of a sudden the game really focuses and drills down on that particular element.
You're always creating new things.
Absolutely.
Part of the nature of this game is it feels modular, and you can really introduce elements that you want in the game or take elements out. For example, when we were first playing the game, we left out scenes and legacies. We felt they complicated the game a little bit too much. How do you guys feel?
Yeah, just to be clear, scenes and legacies are not optional parts of the game. This is built in. But as you don't always have to get to those in the game, it sort of feels like you can put them in or not if you prefer.
I still don't know that I feel like the time you invest in creating scenes is really worth the payout at the other end.
Yeah, scenes do seem to take a lot of time to set up. You know, you're setting up a question, you're defining characters, who's included, who's excluded, and really building that can take a while to. It's hard to get that payoff feel out of it, that's for sure.
For me, scenes are actually a really important part of Microscope because they're a way of drilling down, instead of being an overall plot of, the Galactic Empire and not caring about the characters and the people. It's a way of drilling down and just seeing, what's actually happening with Sir Edward Snorgle.
Yeah, it had some personality to the game, doesn't it?
Yeah. To me, scenes are a really important way of actually bringing in role-playing to the game. It's all about acting. You get to finally act out these characters. You do pose a question at the start of a scene, and that's up to you to decide because you're the one describing it and setting it up. And then with the other players, you work out what characters they want to play. And the scene will continue on until the question that you've asked has been answered.
I really feel like they almost feel like a different game at times though. Like you've got the way you do periods and events and you do these in a very particular way. But then when you get to scenes, it feels like you're almost playing a different game.
We have played a lot of games of Microscope without scenes, and it went a lot faster, and it was just a straight out storytelling game. Here's what happened, and there's your story.
It stayed very high level though, didn't it? You couldn't really get a feel for what the characters were doing and stuff like that. So, you weren't the feet on the ground in those particular games.
Yeah.
I feel like you could probably homebrew something or hack something into the game to introduce like a deeper tier that you really zoom in. Something like, for example's sake, moments where you say, a person did a thing, and so you really have those characters, but without that setup required for scenes.
But this is something that's more detailed than, say, an event.
Yeah, it really zooms in. You've got to have something that zooms into the character level so that you've got some human element.
There is actually an option in the game for this. You can do scenes as dictated scenes, and dictated scenes are just you saying what happened in a moment in time without actually acting it out.
You still have to require who is in the scene and who is excluded from the scene and what the question is, which can be a little bit strange when you ask a question and then go on and immediately answer the question yourself.
So one thing to keep in mind is that you can really start to collaborate around the table, and that's really not the way this game is meant to run. Other players have their turn, anything could happen, and then when it gets around to you again, you are in complete control. You have all the power of deciding where the story goes next.
I'm definitely guilty of that. I tend to get stuck and have no idea what I want to add. Yeah. And then I'll be like, discussion around the table. If someone else comes up with a good idea, can I steal that and use that? I'm not supposed to do that.
Yeah, but the way this game is designed is play stops until that player has contributed to the story. So for new players with unlimited possibilities, it's hard to feel like, what do I do next or what's right? And play just grinds to a halt. So the default to suggest different ideas to that player might sort of feel like it gets the game going again, but it's just not. You're taking your turn again, which is not part of the game.
Yeah, you really have to develop a bit of patience with this game, that you really need to give people the opportunity to think of their own ideas and express their own opinions. You really need to give them that creative flexibility, and you never know what's going to come out of it.
Yeah, like having their perspective in the story is quite important. You'll cover topics that you never even thought about.
You've got to really be clear with new players coming into this game that they might make events a bit wishy-washy, so you've really got to make them definitive, like the harsh crackdowns might lead to a rebellion. Well, you're outside the timeline. You already know if those crackdowns caused a rebellion or not. Put it into the event.
Yeah, so with a rebellion, for example, if you don't want to determine the outcome of this and you still want to play an event, the event could be the rebellion begins and then leave it for other players to determine what the outcome is.
Something that we have a bit of a stumbling upon was when we were playing the first couple of games, you'd get your card and you'd hide it and you'd write your story. But that's not really how the game's supposed to be played. You're supposed to tell the story of what's going on and then come back at the end and really summarize what's going on.
Yeah, it's important for other players to definitely be engaged and activate their active listening skills with this game. You've got to listen to what the other person's contributing, because the card is only going to summarize what they're saying in part of their story.
It's sort of two different ways of playing, and we've seen it happen in all games where someone might think ahead and write down the full story of what they're trying to say, and then when they place the card out, oh, this happens.
They're just reading their card.
They're
basically.
reading their card.
Yeah.
Or you have the alternate play style, which is, I'm telling my story, this is what happens, oh, and then I summarize it on the card afterwards.
Which is how it's meant to be played.
Yeah.
So there's an interesting part of Microscope, and that's legacies. And just reading it straight out of the book, it's sort of hard to get a feel for how they're actually meant to operate and behave in the game.
Legacies are really designed around the premise of having themes that players want included in the game. So when you have a turn and you have a lens, there might be some sort of overarching theme that comes up. You then introduce this as a legacy, and this continues on throughout the game.
Well, it's a way for me as a player to point something out that I like and bring other players' attention to it. So if we're telling a story and I'm like, well, I really like this character, I can point it out. And it's not inside the timeline, it's separate, but it brings everyone's attention to it.
Yeah, I like how that each player can only have one legacy as well. So it's something that you really want to focus and are passionate about for that particular game.
Yeah.
I feel like it gives the game a little bit of direction. Without the legacies, everyone's sort of patching things in and you really aren't going for any particular aim.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because the players going around the table, in the turn sequence, you're sort of moving around to the left around the table, and for you to focus on what you're interested in, if you're to the right of the current person known as the lens, you're waiting the longest for the play to return to you. So to sort of shift over to the right, say, okay, that player there, what are you interested in? I find that useful.
So something we've had happen in some games, unfortunately, we've had a new player come in who saw that when an event happens, like say I created Atlantis, he can turn around and straight away destroy that.
Yeah, you have that power in your next play. That's perfectly valid.
And once it's destroyed, it's destroyed. Like, there's no changing that. And that can be really frustrating because he played off our creative and just kept destroying everything we made. And that was really frustrating. But there's a way to come back from that and just go, no, I don't care. I can still, like, the timeline is flexible in that you can push things further and further forward or further back. So I can still fit in a whole eon of things in between.
So we know Atlantis will fall, but we can just keep stretching that out further and further into the end of the timeline and introduce what we still want to cover, knowing that what the future will hold for Atlantis.
I mean, you can even be a bit reactive and go bigger and bigger creation. I created a city, you destroyed my city. I made a nation, you can destroy that too, that's fine. I'm going to now create a whole new planet. It can put a very interesting spin on a game.
Yeah, but players should not be warring with each other. This is still a collaborative storytelling game at its heart.
After the break, we'll be speaking with the designer of Microscope. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Roll for Adventure. Today we're looking at Microscope. We're lucky enough to be joined by Ben Robbins, the designer of Microscope, all the way from Seattle. Welcome to the show, Ben.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So Ben, what inspired you to create Microscope when you were putting it together?
That's a kind of tricky question. It kind of slowly emerged from my mind, you could say. I was working on it for a very long time before I told anyone it even existed. I guess you could say there were really a couple different avenues that I was exploring at the same time. One was just the idea of the way we look at time and the way we look at history was fascinating to me. That if you think of the way we learn pretty much anything in life, we never learn it going forward. We learn it from this kind of like big picture to zooming into details kind of way. So there was kind of that aspect of it. Also, as a very, very long time, like a Dungeons and Dragons game master, I had spent just decades building worlds and then kind of diving around in them and playing with different parts. And that process of kind of moving around through your world and fleshing out different bits at a time was the natural way that you would build things. And so what I wanted to do was make a game that kind of captured that fun of building a world and exploring the parts of it that you found really interesting instead of just kind of plodding along in order.
So just a bit further in regards to the design of the game, what were your main design goals or particular elements you wanted to achieve?
When I do this thing when I design games, which is that I write down these maxims when I first start, and they're usually like one sentence, very, very short ideas, and they're things that like I want to stick to, and I keep them through the whole design. Like Microscope, the design took place over about 3 years of actual like designing it as a game and then kind of thinking about it before then. And it's very easy when you're designing a game to just drift and forget what you were trying to do, and you get caught up in new ideas, and so your ideas just morphs as you go. Um, so like some of the ideas, like I said before, the idea of creative participation for everyone at the table, um, and also just things like as the design went along, paring it down to its core essentials to be like as simple as humanly possible while still capturing it. There's a lot of kind of uh, widgets and add-ons that were along the way that I tried, and I was like, you know what, that seems interesting, but it doesn't help. And the other thing was um, kind of trusting the players a lot to create a solid framework for guidance, but to then say, instead of like some people would say, oh, why don't you require there to be a scene every round? Force someone to make a scene. And it's like, well, that's reasonable because they need to have more scenes. But I'm like, well, but maybe the players don't want to do that. Maybe the players have other ideas that often we as people have a really good sense of pacing or timing or what's appropriate or what's interesting. So wherever possible, I left those choices in the hands of the player. And when you start saying that, it sounds really loosey-goosey, like, oh, you just let people do whatever. It's like, no, it's very strict in some ways, but it gives you, I mean, you're almost always picking one of three choices, but it's letting you pick which one you want. So it's trusting the players, is the way to put it.
So how would you describe Microscope to someone new to gaming?
Yeah. I play with a lot of strangers.
Yeah,
I play
like
with lots of
conventions
people
and
I've never
that.
met
Yeah.
before. Yeah, conventions. We run a weekly story game Seattle. New people come in all the time. So I play with people I'd never gamed with before, and a lot of the people that come to that are people that never gamed at all. I often find that people that have never gamed in any way, shape, or form are in a way not better, but they're free of a lot of the preconceptions that we have as gamers. They don't say who's my character. They don't wonder what their points are. They're just like, oh, we're making a story. I get it. When I first was working on Microscope, I really thought it would be very hard to explain to people. Like, oh, this is a crazy idea. But when you say like, okay, we're gonna do an overarching story, and then we're gonna zoom into the parts that interest us, they're like, oh, I get it. Done. Great. They have no problem with it. Little kids have no problem with it. They jump right in. They're like, oh yeah, sure. I'll go back 100 years and have this happen. And I'm like, okay. So I think it's if you just say you're going to make an epic history together, we're all going to participate, and you can't, because we're all participating, don't get hung up on your preconceptions. The story's going to go in directions you might not expect, even though we already know the ending. People are basically good.
What can we expect from Explorer?
It's got I went through a lot of different ideas of how to do it. First, I was like, oh, I'll have it be just a lot of advice. And I was like, I don't think I want to write an entire book of just advice. Microscope is solid. Microscope doesn't really need that much help or fixing. So I kind of looked back and said, well, what would be really useful for people instead? Right now, it has a bunch of seeds to get you started. So if you want to sit down and play, particularly with strangers, there's this whole debate, well, what do we want to do? So it has some very concrete ways to get you started. Like you pick this idea and you go, to cut down on that kind of intro time, which eats into play. It also has the real kind of heart and soul of it, I guess you could say, are 3 new ways you can play Microscope that take the ideas of Microscope but apply them differently. So for example, there's Chronicle, which is the simplest, which actually hones Microscope down to be a story of a single thing. So you could be like, oh, let's follow this magic sword through history, or this one city, and it keeps you on. And also, it specifically takes characters and brings them to the forefront. So every period that you go through has an anchor character who's the person who we're seeing the story of that thing through. So that's Chronicle. Then there's Echo, which is a time travel game, and time travel has always been basically forbidden in Microscope, because if you as players are jumping back and forth in time, if you have characters that jump back and forth in time, it defeats the whole purpose. You go back to having kind of a linear game. So Echo actually takes it and says, No, you're basically trying to go back and alter events in the history to get a different outcome. And so as you play, you change things, you tamper with the history, and then you have these unexpected echoes that happen. And what you try to do goes horribly awry, and you're like, no. But the great thing is, so you see, like, oh no, we did something so wrong. We gave automatic weapons to the cavemen. Our history now explodes. Like we've destroyed the future.
So
But
the
since it's
bad
time,
guy is his father,
yeah,
that kind
yeah.
of stuff?
But since it's time travel, you can just go back and fix it. So even if you mess up the entire history, you can say, okay, you know what? We're going to keep going. We're going to go back and change it again and try to solve that problem. So Echo, I thought would be too difficult to work, but now it's very fun. Now
So it's kind of mind-blowing trying to
yeah,
understand these
it's
concepts.
definitely the hardest, I would say, of Microscope. Because there's definitely things change. Suddenly you're like, oh wait, that entire period is different now. The war never happened. You have to keep up with things as they change.
Yeah, I'd love to see that aha moment in players. So that means
Yes.
over there.
Yes, that totally happens. Yeah, we had robots, we had AIs and robots basically that we thought had become merciless killing machines, and then we're like, oh, well, we'll introduce classical music into their programming to make them have more spirit and soul. Like, nope, that just makes them easier to control. Now you play music and they march and they destroy South America, and we're like, no. And then the last game.
What about the third one?
Yeah, the last one is Union, and Union is my favorite, hands down. It's you take the history, but you turn it into a family tree. So you're exploring, you're going back and saying, like, here's this person's parents, here's their parents, and you're seeing these connections of people. So it makes it way more personal and way more, you're really just telling the stories of different people's lives, each union that created the next generation, and seeing how past events or, lifetime shapes people's present. And it's amazing because there's a lot of characters on the table, 17, I think, but because they're all connected by this web of a family tree, you have no problem whatsoever keeping them all in your mind. Like, oh right, yeah, that's because her father did that, and then his grandfather did this. So you have this like fascinating connection, and it's I think because we can all relate to families and to people, it's hands down my favorite so far. So
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Ben. We really appreciate it.
thank you.
That's about it for this week. All that's left is to give our final ratings. To keep in with our theme, we'll be using a dice rating system on Roll for Adventure, from a D4 to a D20. Bonnie, what are you going to give Microscope?
I've played Microscope a heap of times, and I feel it's always a nice one to have on the side that you can just throw in and play with a couple of friends. But it's not up there as one of my favourite role-playing games. To me, it's just a storytelling game. So I'm giving it a D10.
Bren?
Yeah, I wasn't really sure about this game to begin with, but after playing a couple of games, I really got into this, and I'm going to be using this for future world building in D&D campaigns that we put together. So definitely giving this a D12.
Yeah, I really like the nature of the game, and I like the fact that I can throw this out on the table with any sort of player, and I can really introduce new people to the hobby of role-playing with this game. I love how it works, I love the system, and I love its simplicity, so I'm going to give it a D20. You can find out more about Microscope on our website, rollforadventure.com.au. While you're there, you can check out the video for this week's show, as well as exclusive web clips and the full version of our interview with Ben. Next week, we'll be looking at the godfather of RPGs, Dungeons and Dragons. See you then.